Although Mendel studied relatively simple systems, his principles can be applied to complex patterns of inheritance. So we're going to take that go sort of beyond what he was able to originally study. So one of those things that we're going to take a look at is going to be some traits that are going to be controlled by multiple alleles. In other words, multiple allelic traits. In other words, these genes exist in several allelic forms, but each individual is only going to have 2 alleles. When Mendel was studying his pea plants, he noted very binary traits. Plants were either tall or short, nothing in between. Plants were either had purple flowers or white flowers, nothing in between. There are some traits, though, where there's more than just 2 options. The individual could have gene allele A or B or C or D or none of the above or all of the above. A great example of this would be ABO blood types. ABO blood types are an example where we actually have 3 different alleles that are present, or 3 different alleles that are possible, which can lead to a variety of different blood types. We're not limited to just A or B, but we have A, B, or O. So we're going to take just a quick look at our ABO blood types. The alleles that are possible for a blood type are IA, which is the A antigen is going to be present on the red blood cells, and anti-B antibody in the plasma. IB, which would have the B antigen on the red blood cells and anti-A antibody in the plasma, or a lowercase I allelic, which means that there are no antigens in the blood cells and both anti-A and anti-B antibodies in the plasma. Now, the ABO blood types are also an example of co-dominance, meaning that more than one allele is fully expressed. So if you have the allele for the A antigen and the allele for the B antigen, your blood type will be AB. If you have the allele for the A antigen and the O antigen, or if you have the allele for the A blood type and the allele for the O blood type, the allele that will be expressed is A. If you have the allele for B and the allele for O, then the allele that will be expressed is B. So this is an example of codominance. There are more than 1 alleles possible, or more than 2 alleles possible, and some of those alleles can both be dominant at the same time, or they can both express dominance. So here's a great example of the phenotypes and genotypes, and I want to share this slide with you because I think it might be useful when you are going through your genetics lab, examples, especially if you encounter any that deal with blood typing. So the phenotype A is represented by either being dominant for A or being dominant for A, homozygous dominant for A, or heterozygous dominant for A. The phenotype B is indicated by being homozygous dominant for B or heterozygous for B. AB is when we have both A and B, so heterozygous AB, and O is when we are recessive in both cases, or we're recessive for both alleles. There are also instances of incomplete dominance, meaning that the heterozygote has a phenotype that's intermediate between that of either homozygote. So the phenotype reveals genotype. In other words, there's sort of a dominance, but it's not fully dominant. So a great example of this would be flowers. Homozygous red has a red phenotype, and homozygous white has a white phenotype. However, the heterozygote kind of shows up halfway in between. So the red allele is dominant, and the white allele is recessive, but we'll see an incomplete dominance if we are actually heterozygous for the trait. So in this case, the homozygous white is white, homozygous red is red, and heterozygous is going to be pink, halfway in between. There's also incomplete penetrance. Incomplete penetrance means that the dominant allele is there, but it may not necessarily lead to the dominant phenotype. And there are a couple of examples of this. Polydactyly is a great example. The polydactyly is when you have extra digits on hands or your feet or both. Polydactyly is actually a dominant phenotype. However, not all individuals who inherit the dominant phenotype will actually express that trait. So even though it is a dominant gene, there are other systems within the body that may prevent those extra digits from forming. Even though it is genetically dominant, physically it might not be. If there are other systems in the body that kind of take over and say, whoa, I know you think you want more fingers, but actually we got enough, so we're going to just not do that and shut off those genes or inactivate those genes to prevent that from happening. Pleiotropy is also a very interesting non-Mendelian genetic effect. This occurs when a single mutant gene affects two or more distinct and seemingly unrelated traits. A great example of this is Marfan syndrome. Marfan syndrome is a pleiotropic trait, pleiotropic disorder, and it results in the following phenotypes. So there's disproportionately long arms, legs, hands, and feet. There's going to be a weakened aorta and poor eyesight. Those seem really disparate. Like, they seem like they've got nothing in common. What does having a weakened heart have to do with poor eyesight? What does any of that have to do with being unusually tall and lanky? Well, it's because Marfan syndrome is it's a connective tissue disorder. And all of these different systems, your skeletal system, your heart and blood vessels, your eyes, your lungs, your skin, all of those are affected by the connective tissues found in your body. So if we have a disorder that causes connective tissue defects, it can actually cause all of these different disorders. It can cause all of these different problems found throughout the body. There's also a case of polygenic inheritance. Polygenic inheritance is really interesting. It occurs when a trait is governed by two or more alleles. Fantastic example of this would be height. Each dominant allele has a quantitative effect on the phenotype, and those effects are additive, meaning that there's not, at least in humans, there's not one trait that says tall versus short, or there's not one gene that says tall versus short. There are actually a lot of different genes that are involved in height. So it's possible, so it's possible that you could get, let's just say, for example, there are 10 genes that govern height. Let's say that your dad has 7 dominant alleles for tall and 3 dominant alleles for short. And let's say that your mom has 8 dominant alleles for tall and 2 dominant alleles for short. It is very possible that you could end up with 10 dominant alleles for tall, which would put you taller than either of your parents. It is also possible that you could end up with 5 dominant alleles for tall and 5 recessive alleles for short, and end up shorter than either of your parents. So these effects tend to be additive. You could get some from your mom, some from your dad, and be significantly taller or significantly shorter or halfway in between. This polygenic inheritance, I think, is what caused a lot of the confusion with the blending theory of inheritance, because this is something that we do see. We do see that offspring tend to look like a cross between their two parents, and that has to do with a lot of things like polygenic inheritance and the fact that there's an independent assortment, so you could get some traits from your mom, some from your dad, so on and so forth. So polygenic inheritance is a really interesting variation, and there are a couple of things that influence that are polygenic. Skin color is polygenic. This is why you could turn out to be significantly darker or lighter than your parents. Height, eye color, all of that is polygenic, influenced by multiple genes that have an additive effect. All right, the last one that we want to talk about is X-linked inheritance. So up till now, we've been looking at autosomal chromosomes and their inheritance. However, there have been a lot of interesting studies that have been done exclusively with the genes that are present on the X chromosome and can lead to interesting inheritance patterns for future generations. So to get started, let's talk about how in mammals, the X and Y chromosomes determine gender. Females are XX, males are XY. Now, the interesting thing is that there are certain genes that are linked to the X chromosome that have nothing to do with gender. So they're not really in any way related to gender. They just happen to be carried on the X chromosome. X-linked genes are carried on that X chromosome, and the Y chromosome does not carry those genes. Oops. A great example of this, I'm going to, so the Y chromosome does not carry these genes. A great example of this is color blindness. The gene for color blindness is carried on the X chromosome, and so it's going to have a very different inheritance pattern in males versus females. I am going to leave this in the air and let you spend a little bit of time looking over this in your textbook. I'm also going to let you spend some time looking at it in using tutorial videos. There will be some X-linked inheritance traits in your lab this week. We will definitely go over X-linked inheritance. I've got a lot of personal stories to share about this and how certain traits can be passed down from one generation to the next. But a lot of this will be much easier to do if I can draw a Punnett square diagram for you. So we're going to save this discussion to have live during our in-person meetings. Here is a fantastic diagram. I enjoy this very much. It's a pedigree chart of the X-linked traits, specifically hemophilia, and how it gets passed down through the royal families of Europe. I personally am a history buff, so I enjoyed this chart very much. I studied a lot of these individuals. So please feel free to spend some time looking through this. It's a really cool diagram showing some of the interrelatedness of the families of Europe. And that's it for this chapter. Please let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns.